Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. The growing divide between the European Union and Britain widened dramatically last week with the nomination of former Luxembourg Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker for European Commission President. British Prime Minister David Cameron publicly opposed the nomination, going so far as to demand an unprecedented vote on the appointment of Juncker at an EU summit in Brussels last Friday. His objections to the nomination include questions over Juncker's capability to preside over the EU, as well as the manner in which he was selected. The selection of Juncker, as put forward by the EU Parliament rather than the Council, Cameron warned, marks a power grab by the Parliament and an irreversible shift of control over the European Union from national governments to Brussels. That's from the New York Times, June 25th. I believe that the European Commission President should be chosen by the elected heads of government, heads of state on the European Council. That is the right approach, and it is wrong to sign up to this power grab by the parties of Europe and the European Parliament. That's from David Cameron. The Juncker nomination might affect Britain's willingness to stay in the EU, Cameron warned, adding that support was already wafer thin in the UK. Despite Cameron's impassioned speech to EU leaders over lunch, Juncker won the nomination by a landslide. This has many British officials and commentators now openly admitting what we have been saying for decades, that Britain will not be part of the coming United States of Europe.
This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world.
And he said unto me, you must prophesy again.
This whole process has simply reinforced my conviction that Europe needs to change. That was a clear message delivered by voters at the European elections. Europe has to change to succeed.
That was David Cameron's response to the Juncker appointment last week. He's calling upon Europe to change, but Europe won't change. Europe is not going to change to accommodate the wishes of those nations that are out on the fringe, like Britain. As we've been telling you for many months now, Europe is going to downsize and consolidate and become a much stronger union because of it. And it's all prophesied in your Bible. This coming United States of Europe that will be dominated by Germany. I want to refer you to an article we had in the Trumpet Weekly on Friday, Why Britain is Closer Than Ever to Quitting the EU. That's by Richard Palmer, and he has a lot of statements in there by this new president, Juncker, who said a few years ago, I'm for secret, dark debates. He's all for that. He's not really for democracy, giving the people a say. He's for imposing his will, the will of the bureaucrats, on the people. This is a man who's been caught lying and has even admitted to lying. Mr. Palmer talks about that in his article, and he doesn't apologize for that. He says when the going gets tough, you have to lie. When the going gets tough, you have to do it. And, well, at least he's honest about that. A lot of leaders, a lot of politicians do it, as we know. But he almost seems proud of it. When the people of France and the Netherlands voted on whether or not to accept the European Constitution, Juncker was quoted as saying, if it's a yes, we will say on we go. And if it's a no, we will say we continue. Doesn't matter. Who cares what they think? Who cares what they do? We will move forward. We will continue. That's been this man's position. And as Mr. Palmer covers in that featured article that we ran last week in the Trumpet Weekly, this is a man who won't let anything, whether it's truth or democracy or democratic principles, none of that. He's not going to let any of that get in the way of his dream, which is for this federalized Europe, a United States of Europe. That's what he wants. And now you see Europe getting on board with that core group of nations that we've been telling you about. Or if they don't, as we'll read later, they get a stern look from Germany and they quickly fall in line. That's what's been happening. You can see why Britain's prime minister was so opposed to this appointment. He did everything he could to prevent this from happening, but he failed in the end. And many of the British people now want out because they know going in means losing their sovereignty. This is a quote from the Times in London. It said, this is just from last week, Britain is heading for the exit. Something seriously impressive has to be achieved to change our course. That's what many of the commentators over there are acknowledging now. That Britain is on the way out. And that particular quote comes from one that actually supports Britain being in the Union. And even he acknowledges that they're on the way out. Here's another one from the Telegraph. It's basically picking it up in the middle of a quote, saying that if Juncker was chosen, that it will be a historic disaster on a grand scale, which makes Britain's exit from the European Union very likely. And I speak as someone who has been for reform and staying in the EU, if possible. He's for staying in the EU, but he too is acknowledging that this is the inevitable end for Britain. They are on the way out. Another commentator from the same paper, the Telegraph, he said, if Jean-Claude Juncker is chosen to be the next president of the Commission, Britain will eventually have to leave the European Union. It will have to leave because of the radical ideas and views of this new president of the Commission. They're going to have to leave. Now, if this is what people that were actually for Britain being in the Union are saying, what do you think those that are for Europe or Britain coming out are saying? Like UKIP and other parties like that want to maintain their independence. A lot of them were actually excited about Juncker's appointment because they looked at that as the next step toward Britain leaving, which is what they want. Now, Prime Minister Cameron has promised a referendum on Britain's membership in the EU in 2017. He's also talked a lot about negotiating a new relationship with Europe, getting Europe to rethink some of its policies. But as I said a moment ago, that relationship is not going to be renegotiated. Germany's leading the way and imposing its views on the entire continent. And we're at a point right now where you either fall in line with what Germany wants or you're going to be on the outside looking in. That's what's happening. One European commissioner reported, Mr. Palmer covers this in his article, he reportedly said, we don't include the UK in our plans anymore. We assume you're leaving the EU. Just speaking bluntly. We've got to move forward. We assume that you're leaving. So there's not going to be any renegotiations. What's interesting, too, with this story, if you look at the backstory leading up to it, is that Prime Minister Cameron went out and really spoke out against this nomination. And he had the support early on from Angela Merkel, the German leader, but she later changed her mind. And it really left Mr. Cameron out on a limb on his own. And as I said, it's not just driving Britain away from Europe. It's driving Europe away from Britain. It's driving a wedge between the two. It's not just many British people are anxious to get out of that union. Many Europeans are anxious to show them the door so that they can move forward with this federalized Europe, this United States. This is from Spiegel Online, June 2nd, about a month ago. Britain is important to be sure. This is how the German press is reacting to Britain's strong stance. Britain is important to be sure, but the choice between a more democratic EU and Britain's continued membership is clear. Of course, it's not a more democratic EU. It's a more dictatorial EU. Most of the members in the EU don't even know who Juncker is. So it's hardly democratic, but it's being sold as that. But the British people are waking to the fact that it's not. And that by joining, they're going to be forced to go along and to lose many of their freedoms. Now, if you think about what we've been telling you for many, many years, and Mr. Palmer reminds you of that in that Trumpet Weekly article about Britain's departure from that union, Mr. Armstrong, Herbert W. Armstrong, wrote in his last work, Mystery of the Ages, which was published in 1985, he was commenting on a prophecy in Isaiah 14, and he said that that prophecy was speaking of the soon coming, quote, the soon coming resurrected Holy Roman Empire, a sort of soon coming United States of Europe, a union of 10 nations to rise up out of or following the common market of today. That's what was in place in 1985, this common market. Nobody was saying it was going to be a United States of Europe, not back then. Of course, he was saying it back in the 1950s and 60s as well. This particular quote's from his last work, as I said, Mystery of the Ages. He went on to say in that same quote, Britain will not be in that empire soon to come. That's from Mystery of the Ages, a book that we've offered to you freely many, many times. Britain will not be a part of that empire soon to come. That 10-nation superpower prophesied in your Bible, a prophecy Mr. Armstrong referred to on so many occasions. And now we see really both trends being fulfilled. The first one, Britain not being part of it, and of course the second, the bigger development, the fact that that federalized Europe is coming together. And there's now many people in Europe calling for a United States of Europe. I mean, they're calling it that, which is what Mr. Armstrong called it decades ago, when no one would have expected this to happen. And now it's happening. Let me just show you a few more articles that have appeared this week, today, following on the news from last week, which Mr. Palmer discussed in his Trumpet Weekly article. This is from the Telegraph. It says, this is June 30th today, in today's Telegraph, David Cameron says that he opposed Jean-Claude Juncker as European Commission President because the appointment involved an effective transfer of power. National governments collectively surrendered their veto over who runs the European Commission to the European Parliament. However, there was another swing, which was at least equally important, a power shift from everyone else to Berlin. A power shift from all these other nations to Germany, in other words. That's what he's saying. He says, I said all along the next European Commission president would be decided by the EU1, but the extent of it was remarkable, beyond anything we saw, even during the Eurozone crisis. One glare from Merkel and the Swedish and Dutch prime ministers switched sides. All it took was one stern glare, and they immediately followed right along with Germany. This one last statement from the article. If Germany is attempting to hide its power in Europe, it's doing a terrible job. It's doing a terrible job of hiding its true intentions. And that is to dominate. That has been its character, its national character, to dominate Europe. And we see it happening. Again, who's calling the shots in Europe, as that author brings out? I mean, this is even more evident now with this crisis than it was during the Eurozone crisis. Remember when Germany's bailing out all those poorer nations as they were effectively giving up their sovereignty? And now we see the UK drawing a line in the sand, and Germany saying, go ahead, get on out. We've got everyone else inside together with us. Another one, this is from the Daily Mail. Notice the headline at the top, divorce is now the only course left for Britain and the EU. This is from June 28th. At tea time on Friday, it became clear that Britain could no longer remain a member of the EU. Any hope that we might change its nature, make it looser, more flexible, more attuned to its nation states, was coldly extinguished. They know now. They're not going to change Germany. It's Germany that's changing Europe. That's what we've been saying all along. It says, knocking British objections aside, EU leaders entrusted the top slot to a man who has never hidden his support for a United States of Europe. He's never hidden his support for this. It's well documented. One last statement from this article. The choice we face is between leaving the EU or becoming, over time, a province of a country called Europe. See, the United States of Europe, in which Britain would just be one little state. And they don't want that. And so they're going to pull out or be kicked out however it happens. But when it does, I mean, you're going to be able to say you heard it here first. As we've been telling you this, preparing you for this, decades now, going back to even the early days right after World War II. Notice there that previous statement, it talked about the United States of Europe. Now you compare that with what the Italian Prime Minister said just a few weeks ago, or this isn't even 2 weeks, I think it was a week and a half. This is from the Daily Telegraph. Italy, it says, to push for United States of Europe when it holds the EU presidency. It's the next. It's scheduled to be the next president, an Italian. Italy is going to head it up. And they're going to be pushing, too, for a United States of Europe. It says launching an appeal to convince European leaders to show that a stronger and more cohesive Europe is the only solution to solve the problems of our time. Mr. Renzi, that's the Italian Prime Minister, said, "For my children's future, I dream, think, and work for the United States of Europe." That's what he's pushing for. Italy. Part of that Axis power during the World War II era. They're pushing for it. Juncker's pushing for it. That's what that core, that solid core, wants. Britain, of course, doesn't want that. But the core in Europe certainly does. Notice this headline from the Express in the UK. Germany controls the EU. We must get out now. Germany controls it. We've got to get out. Fear of Germany was one of the driving forces behind the creation of the European Union. In the 8 decades before 1950, aggressive Teutonic militarism had plunged Europe into 3 savage conflicts, leaving millions dead and entire nations ravaged. It says the architects of European political integration were determined this should never happen again. What he's saying there is that initially the European Union was designed to keep Germany under control, to keep Germany under wraps. And yet the reverse of that is happening. Germany's in charge. It reminds me, this quote, it reminds me of a statement we drew attention to almost 20 years ago now from Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister, who said this back in 1995, "You have not anchored Germany to Europe. You have anchored Europe to a newly dominant, unified Germany." She said, "In the end, my friends, you'll find it will not work." Was she right? Was she right about that? It's not Germany being anchored to Europe. It's the other way around. And here we are at the end, and we're finding that what they set out to accomplish initially, it hasn't worked. It's been a failure. It is, she went on to say in that same quote, that it's in Germany's national character to dominate, and that's what we see playing out. Germany is the dominant country. Let's look at Isaiah 10, just read a few verses here before we conclude. You notice there that Mrs. Thatcher and other astute commentators, they knew that if these nations came together in Europe, they knew who would emerge as the dominant nation, the dominant country. Bernard Connolly in The Rotten Heart of Europe, talking also about the European Union, he said it was just a cloak for German ambitions. It's concealed Germany's ambitions, which is to dominate the continent. And of course, we know it's even going to go beyond the borders of Europe. Many Bible prophecies tell us that. This is Isaiah 10 here in verse 5. It says, O Assyrian, the rod of my anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. Assyria refers to Germany today. The Assyrians, the ancient Assyrians, they are the modern-day nation of Germany, and God says here He's going to use the Assyrian people as a rod, as a mechanism for punishment that's coming on our peoples. Verse 6 says, I will send him against an hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him charge to take the spoil and to take the prey and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. And verse 7 says, Howbeit he means not so, neither does his heart think so, but it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. The Bible tells us that God is going to actually use Germany for a special purpose. He's going to use Germany and the United States of Europe for a special purpose. They're going to punish the people of Israel, this hypocritical nation, as it's called in the Scriptures. And that would include not just the people of Ephraim in Britain today, but the United States as well, which is Manasseh in prophecy. Both of our peoples, I mean, that alone is the strongest indicator you need of the fact that Britain is not going to be part of this federalized Europe that's now forming, this United States of Europe. Because the Bible talks about that European Union being used by God to correct His hypocritical people. Of course, you can leave aside the Bible for a moment and just go back in history and see that the British people and the people of Germany have been traditional enemies. I mean, you don't even have to go back that far in history to see that. Well, we see these lines being drawn in Europe, and we see prophecy really moving forward at an alarmingly fast rate. The Trumpet Weekly comes out every Friday. We email it to tens of thousands of subscribers, and we collect in it each week all the developments, all the news stories that are prophetically significant. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure you go to thetrumpet.com to subscribe. This booklet here that I'll draw your attention to, Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, you can call the number there on your screen to get a free copy of that sent to your mailbox, or you can find an electronic copy of it, again, at thetrumpet.com. And this booklet talks about some of those things we touched on here at the end of the program. Margaret Thatcher's comments back in 1995, this prophecy here in Isaiah 10. If you don't have this in your library, make sure that you contact one of our operators or go to thetrumpet.com to get your free copy today. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on The Trumpet Daily.